is home to some of the world's most extreme terrain.
It's one of the most hostile climates on Earth. It's winter for 8 months of the year.
This place is hardcore. It's almost as if everything is trying to kill you.
It's flat, it's white, it's just snow as far as the eye can see.
Despite it being so remote, researchers working out on the glaciers make an incredible discovery deep beneath the surface.
They're out there working with ground-penetrating radar, and suddenly they locate a large chunk of metal under the ice.
It doesn't take long to confirm that the mystery chunk of metal is a World War II plane. But how did it get here?
It's 300 feet below the ice. And stranger still, it's not the only plane down there.
This unpopulated part of southeastern Greenland is home to dozens of wrecked airplanes. It's an aviation graveyard.
What could have brought them all down in this one particular spot?
It's no surprise that this area has become known as Greenland's Bermuda Triangle. To understand why all these planes were flying over here to begin with, you have to go back to World War II. After joining the Allies, the United States faced the problem of transporting their massive bombing fleet to bases in Great Britain. To avoid German U-boats that were decimating ships in the Atlantic Ocean, they started flying rather than shipping aircraft across the North Atlantic to Allied bases in Great Britain. All these planes had to land in Canada and Greenland to refuel, which meant crossing over the treacherous ice cap. A high percentage of these planes unexpectedly crashed in southeastern Greenland, and sometimes the planes sent out to rescue them suffered a similar fate.
These aircraft were flown by expertly trained military pilots who would have been used to flying in extreme conditions.
What is it about this particular part of Greenland that was bringing these planes down? The researchers who discovered the plane deep within the ice believe it may have been one of the infamous Lost Squadron. A squadron of U.S. planes consisting of 6 P-38s and 2 B-17s was traveling along the Snowball route. The squadron fueled up in Greenland without incident, but heading east over the ice cap, flying at 12,000 feet, they encountered a problem.
The radio operators attempted to make contact with another plane flying just ahead of them, but there was no answer.
2 hours from the closest airbase, the pilots were forced to make a sudden and unexpected emergency landing on a glacier.
So the surface of an ice sheet is just snow. It's like a snowdrift that extends forever. And if you tried to land a plane on it that wasn't designed to land on the ice, that didn't have specially equipped skis on it, the wheels would sink. It would have to be an emergency situation for you to land there.
The squad lead was the first to take the plunge, landing hard and flipping over. One by one, they all descended and suffered similar fates. But miraculously, no one was injured. The pilots were rescued and the planes were abandoned, left to rust out, eventually to be swallowed whole by the ice. What forced these planes to make an emergency landing on the glacier? Blizzards in Greenland can happen with no warning at all. They form when the northern polar jet stream clashes with the warmer, moist air moving up from the south, creating catastrophic blizzards in minutes.
Let's say, suddenly, out of the blue, the squadron is surrounded by a blizzard. Freezing temperatures start to ice the wings. The heating in the planes is basically non-existent.
This P-38 from World War II was rudimentary. It didn't have the capabilities nor the equipment we have now.
Planes of that era couldn't fly high enough to avoid the blizzards for long, so there was nowhere to go.
They're flying through thick, heavy cloud. The ice cap and the sky are all the same color, so they can't even tell where the horizon is.
The pilot's hands and feet are so frozen, they can barely steer.
You're 2 hours from the closest airport, you can't make radio contact, and you're also running out of fuel.
There was nowhere to go but down.
Landing on the glacier was their only option, one that proved to be the right decision. Antarctica, one of the most brutally cold places in the world. A frozen desert where no life exists except for at its melting edges. On its southern side sits a deep bay known as the Ross Sea. It's here that America's McMurdo Station has become a hub of international polar exploration.
It's a bleak and inhospitable place. Blizzards and katabatic winds can blow in from nowhere and last for days.
In 1963, a lookout on the American icebreaker USS Edisto spots a stadium-sized iceberg in the Ross Sea and signals for the ship to stop.
The Ross Sea, it's a graveyard for these enormous icebergs that calve off the front of the Ross ice shelf. It happens all the time there.
The cliffs of the iceberg are an incredible 9 stories high.
But about halfway up, there's a strange dark smear visible in the pristine ice.
As the ship gets closer, it looks like debris stuck in the iceberg. But what is it?
In Antarctica, planes go missing at an alarming rate. So maybe these are the remains of a plane that crashed into the side of an iceberg?
To see better, the captain creeps the Edisto as close to the iceberg as he dares. Suddenly, a dark shadow snaps into focus. Huge boards of wood and large pieces of canvas are sticking out of the iceberg's face. The crew of the Edisto marvel at this strange sight. Could these materials be from a lost camp once used by Antarctic explorers? In the early 1900s, adventurers were obsessed with discovering the South Pole. Famous Antarctic pioneers like Robert F. Scott, Ernest Shackleton, and Admiral Richard Byrd all built camps on the continent.
If it is one of these famous explorers' camps, how could it have gotten onto one of these giant icebergs in the first place?
A helicopter is readied and flies over the iceberg for a better look. The flapping sections of canvas appear to be large pieces of tarpaulin. The wooden boards look like the interior walls of a hut.
What is the tarpaulin covering? Could it be the roof of some kind of makeshift structure?
When the helicopter lands on the surface of the iceberg, the crew are stunned.
4 thick poles are jutting out of the ice. They look like telephone poles.
The presence of these poles clearly indicate that this was some kind of camp.
But do these poles provide enough of a clue to figure out whose camp it is?
In 1940, just 3 miles into the Ross Ice Shelf, an American crew is building Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd's 3rd Antarctic base, Little America 3.
By then, Byrd had completed 2 successful trips to Antarctica. He was well on his way to being considered a legendary explorer.
He was the first person to fly across the South Pole.
Little America 3 was bigger than his first 2 camps, with room for more equipment and a powerful radio broadcasting station that required several large telephone poles for transmission.
Are these large poles sticking out of the iceberg evidence of Byrd's old camp? Well, they could be, but they have to be completely sure.
there is one smoking gun piece of evidence that, if found, would confirm that this was Byrd's camp.
Byrd arrived in Antarctica with what at the time was the most advanced piece of equipment ever built for polar exploration.
He called it the Antarctic Snow Cruiser. Part ice tank, part ice bus, part invincible travel lodge.
It was last seen partially buried on the Ross Ice Shelf. If they can find that, they'll have found a monumental relic of polar exploration.
In 1959, at the height of the Cold War, America wanted to experiment with new concepts of polar construction. In a remote region of Greenland, they set about building a city under ice called Camp Century. This type of construction had never been attempted before, but the U.S. Army engineers were confident in the design. A system of 23 trenches would be dug into the ice cap and then covered with steel arches and snow.
There was nothing simple about this project. The nearest port is 150 miles to the west, and the only way to transport supplies is over the ice.
You have an extremely wide expanse of heavily crevassed ice, deadly crevasses. Entire vehicles could fall into these crevasses. And it's extremely cold. You get temperatures, -40, -50. It takes specialized equipment, and it takes a lot of effort and a lot of money to get anything out to the middle of the ice sheet.
A project of this scale and scope would have been so expensive and so risky. You have to ask yourself, why are they doing this? What is the purpose of this underground city?
Many now ask, was there another, more ominous reason the U.S. military decided to build a city under the ice at the ends of the Earth? If the engineers knew the true intent, they weren't talking. They were busy battling the effects of the Arctic sun, which blazes around the clock in the summertime.
It's called the Midnight Sun, and it posed a constant threat to the stability of the walls they were creating. But the upshot with building with snow is that you never run out of supplies.
Once the steel arches were in place, crews put snow blocks on top for support. Then they sprayed the whole structure with powdered snow, which hardened under the sun into a durable surface.
So when snow first falls, it's kind of fluffy, we know that. But when it compresses, it becomes more like cinder block, and you can actually build buildings with that material.
Once the trenches were complete, they cut passageways between the tunnels and then closed off the ends with walls of snow, ensuring nothing gets in and nothing gets out.
The design of this station was ingenious. This had never been done before, but very few people were privy to the real purpose behind this space. What was the reason for all the secrecy?
It took a little more than a year to build Camp Century, which included barracks for 200 men, mess halls, maintenance shops, kitchens capable of feeding hundreds, state-of-the-art scientific labs, a church, and even a barber shop, all powered by a state-of-the-art mobile nuclear reactor, the first of its kind.
The US Army only had 6 of these, and it was by far the most expensive component. It was roughly 3/4 of the cost of the entire base was just that reactor.
All told, the underground city cost US taxpayers $8 million to construct.
To put that into perspective, it's the equivalent of about $71 million today.
Within a few weeks, the crew that built the city were shipped out, and the scientists moved in and started work. At least that's what the US military told the world. America's public message was simple and innocent. Camp Century studies snow. But just a few miles from the station, another project was taking place, one of a more sinister design.
They were building a 1.5-mile long railway track under the ice. The strange thing was, the track led nowhere.
A railway track leading nowhere, a research station that had no business being there, and a group of scientists worried about it decades later. None of it adds up. The disturbing truth would take years to come out. As Cold War relations intensified, the United States was looking for a way to be able to launch a nuclear strike more quickly and effectively.
The American government told the world that the sole purpose for Camp Century was to conduct advanced scientific polar research, but newly declassified documents now reveal its true purpose.
Camp Century was one of the most elaborate cover stories in the history of the Cold War. Its true identity? Project Iceworm.
The U.S. Army Brain Trust calculated that they could launch a nuclear attack on Russia from Greenland in half the time it would take from the American mainland.
Project Iceworm's ultimate objective was to build a military launch site hidden under the ice, big enough that it could house 600 nuclear missiles, all aimed at Moscow.
But it never happened.
The only nuclear device that ever made it to Greenland was the reactor that powered the camp itself.
Why didn't the Americans arm the underground station? It turns out they should have done a little more research on the Greenland Ice Cap.
The Greenland ice sheet moves in a couple of ways. The ice flows under its own weight towards the coast, and it flows at different speeds in different places. But also the snow compacts down into glacial ice. Anywhere you are on the ice sheet, it's in a constant state of motion.
U.S. Army engineers miscalculated how fast the ice sheet was moving. So by the late 1960s, Camp Century was starting to collapse.
As the ice shifts, straight tunnels become curved, and the tunnels close in on each other as the snow is compacting.
I think they realized pretty quickly that this environment was never going to be safe enough to house hundreds of nuclear warheads.
With Camp Century having been abandoned over 50 years now, why are scientists camping out, keeping an eye on it?
The answer is in how they abandoned the base. While the military removed the nuclear reactor, they left everything else, wrongly believing that the snow and ice would crush the remaining debris and safely entomb the toxic material forever.
They left a lot of waste at Camp Century. They left behind huge caches of fuel. They left behind buildings full of PCBs and other construction materials. And they left behind all the coolant water from the nuclear reactor. It's all still there. So if and when Camp Century ever melts out, all those wastes that were left behind, all those toxins, will find their way through rivers and streams out to the coast where people live.
Scientists continue to monitor the temperatures of the snow and ice, hoping to predict how the ice sheet will behave over the next century. At this point, it's anyone's guess. Novi Port, Russia. A small sea town on Siberia's northern Yamal Peninsula is home to a frozen secret.
This place is extreme. It's north of the Arctic Circle and winter for about 8 months out of the year.
There are no roads in or out of this place. Everything comes in by boat. It gets battered by terrible storms, and it can be iced in for months at a time.
A group of scientists working near the River Ob come across a dilapidated wooden hut on the beach, half buried in snow. Inside the hut, they find a ramp leading down into a large, dark tunnel, which is at least 15 feet across and 7 feet high.
It's absolutely stunning. The floors, walls, and ceilings of the tunnel are covered in a glittering layer of frost.
Further investigation reveals thousands of feet of interconnected underground tunnels and over 200 small caves branching off them, all with frosted walls.
They seem to go on and on forever, like some type of really cool icy labyrinth. It's really cool, but what is this place?
The ground in this part of Siberia is entirely permafrost. The tunnels have been dug into the icy earth that's as solid as rock.
It would have taken an extreme effort to dig such an extensive network of caves and tunnels in such hard ground.
Gas, coal, and anthracite are all actively mined in Russia's Arctic region, including on the Yamal Peninsula. The village of Novi port was established as a coal bunkering port in the 1920s as part of the Northern Sea shipping passage. The route traveling along Russia's Arctic coast is so long that the Soviets tried to fuel boat voyages by using locally mined coal at each stop.
Scientists don't find any evidence of big machines or industrial mining operations in these tunnels, so it couldn't have been a mine.
But running along the ceiling throughout the tunnels are old electrical wires and lights. People were clearly down here regularly. But what were they doing?
This part of Siberia is known for its horrific winter weather. So could the Novi port community be trying to escape the freezing conditions?
Entire underground cities are known to have been built in places where the climate is too harsh to live. In Coober Pedy, Australia, residents of the town near the area's extensive opal mines escaped the exhausting desert climate by living underground.
The tunnels of Novi port show no signs of domestication. Plus, above ground, there are clearly enough regular houses for the 2,000 people that live there.
So if they weren't escaping the elements, were the tunnels built as an escape for something else?
The ancient Turkish city of Derinkuyu went 18 stories below the surface, complete with living quarters, shops, and escape routes. In case of attack, the city's population of 20,000 could quickly retreat from their above-ground houses and live entirely underground.
But no one could live in these Siberian tunnels for any significant length of time. It's way too cold. And there's no evidence of any infrastructure or even a source of water that would make it habitable.
During the Cold War, the Soviet economy was fragile, and its people were faced with frequent shortages of money and food. But the frozen Siberian tundra is no place for large-scale animal farming, and the main industry was fishing.
So given the proximity of these tunnels to the main port of a fishing community, it's entirely possible that these tunnels could have been a giant freezer for local fishermen.
After the fishing season ends, the Kara Sea freezes solid, blocking the shipping lane for at least 6 months. Until ships could access the ports in the spring, the fish needed to be frozen. However, the Yamal Peninsula is so remote that the cost of providing the electricity required to power huge electric freezers was too high for the Soviet Union.
The Soviet government did what the inhabitants of the region had done for centuries. They harnessed the might of the USSR to build a massive permafrost cache, a supersized version of what people had done at home for generations. Compared to transporting heavy machinery and materials to build refrigerated warehouses, it was cheaper for Stalin to use people from across the Soviet Union who had been exiled to Novi port as forced labor to dig in the frozen ground.
For 6 years, the state forced laborers to use pickaxes and shovels to dig deep into the frozen ground.
It was sub-zero most of the year, and the ground is frozen so solid that their tools would have been snapping constantly. Those conditions must have been unbelievably harsh.
When the tunnels were completed, they could hold up to 1,750 tons of fish. The local economy flourished as they could control the market for their prized catch.
It was an ingenious plan, but ultimately short-lived. Due to changing temperatures, the caves are no longer structurally stable and they can't be used to their full capacity.
These bizarre frozen underground tunnels aren't an ominous secret Cold War bunker, but the remains of the world's largest refrigerator, a living reminder of the might of the Soviet system, hidden behind a rickety shed in the middle of nowhere.